Hello, today we're going to talk about biological membranes. The biological membrane is the structure that separates the inside of the cell from the external environment. This is a very important structure on the cell as it helps to maintain the nice and balanced homeostatic environment inside of the cell. So this biological membrane is very vital. It has several important functions for helping the cell to sustain itself, and we'll take a look at that today. So some learning objectives that we'd like to accomplish through this lesson is to evaluate the importance of membranes to the cell. Why are they important? We'd like to describe the composition of biological membranes, describing the makeup. What is this biological membrane made up of? We like to summarize the function of some of the membrane proteins, all right? We'd like to describe the function of a selectively permeable membrane, all right? We'll look at some mechanisms and processes for getting things into and across this selectively permeable barrier. We'll contrast diffusion, osmosis, active transport, and we'll look at some other mechanisms for getting substances into and out of the cell today. So biological membranes are important in order to help maintain an important internal environment, all right, in order for the cell to carry out the chemical processes that are required for life. So every single cell is surrounded by this plasma membrane, all right? Now this is in contrast to some other structures that we'll look at in our next chapter that may be unique to different cell types. For example, the cell wall. The cell wall is not a structure that you're gonna find in every cell, all right? But the cell has a plasma membrane. All cells have a plasma membrane that has the first important function of separating the cell from the external environment, okay? Secondly, the plasma membrane functions to regulate the passage of materials into and out of the cell. And so as you can imagine, this cell is a living entity, right? And we definitely need a mechanism for helping to regulate what's coming in and what's coming out. This is a biological system. Things need to come in, substances, nutrients, water, oxygen, things need to be able to pass through this membrane, and we also need to be able to release things out. And this plasma membrane is going to serve as the regulating factor for getting things into and out of the cell. And so these biological membranes are very complex structures, right? They're made up mostly of lipids and protein molecules. All right, we're going to look at this structure in a little bit more detail in the few slides here. One of the things that we think about here is that it's going to function to regulate the passage of materials into and out of the cell. All right, the membrane can also serve as a surface for chemical reactions to take place. All right, the cell membrane facilitates adhesion between cells. Cell-cell interactions, all right? We know that cells interact together to form tissues, all right? So we need mechanisms for this cell-cell adhesion. That's gonna take place at the membrane level. And then lastly, at the membrane, there can be signal transduction going on, okay? So the cell membrane serves as a means to transmit signals between the environment into the internal cell, inside of the cell, okay? So biological membranes perform very many vital functions in order for the cell to sustain itself. Let's look at the structure of this membrane, okay? The cell membrane is mostly made up of lipids and proteins. It's made up of a special type of lipid known as a phospholipid. Okay, so the cell membrane is said to be a fluid bilayer of phospholipids. And what that means is that we just have two layers of lipids joining together, forming this continuous barrier around the cell. Now, the phospholipid is a very special molecule, has special properties, and we'll refer to it as an amphipathic molecule because it contains both a hydrophobic component as well as a hydrophilic component. All right, so the phospholipid bilayer, so we have two layers of phospholipids interacting together, forming a continuous barrier around the cell, okay? A single phospholipid has a hydrophilic head, which are the red circles we see at the top of that phospholipid molecule. And then we have those hydrophobic tails that are congregating together in the middle. Okay, that's responsible for that selectively permeable characteristics of the cell membrane because of those hydrophobic tails interacting together in the middle. Phospholipids, again, are going to form this bilayer structure where we have our hydrophilic heads that are going to come in contact with water. That's the red circular part of the phospholipid. And then we have those hydrophobic tails that are buried on the internal, in the interior structure away from water. All right, so you should understand, descriptively what this membrane looks like if we were to look at it under the microscope. If you look at this image that we have here in the bottom right corner, we have a 3D image of the cell. All right, we see the cell membrane is made up of, again, this bilayer of phospholipids, and we're clear that the external environment for the cell is an aqueous environment, is made up of water, it's a solution. And then also inside of the cell, the internal compartments are also, or the internal environment is also an aqueous solution. And so we have these hydrophilic heads interacting with water in the external environment as well as inside of the cell. So I mentioned before that the plasma membrane is made up of lipids and proteins. All right, so we talked about the phospholipid. Let's look at some of the proteins that are embedded inside of this phospholipid bilayer. All right, these proteins that are present have very important roles in cellular activity. Okay, first and foremost, the transport of material. We mentioned already that it's important that certain substances be able to be transported into the cell. All right, proteins that are embedded in the membrane are going to facilitate this process. All right, we also want to be able to transmit information into the cell, so that signal transduction is taking place by way of proteins that are embedded at the cell membrane. And then lastly, we talked about adhesion. Okay, so cell membrane proteins function to connect cells to other cells in order to form tissues. These are some very important roles of membrane proteins, okay, for the cell. So there's two major classes of membrane proteins that are defined by how tightly they are associated with that lipid bilayer. So we have our integral proteins, and then we have peripheral proteins, okay? Integral membrane proteins are going to be those that are firmly bound to the membrane, okay? They are typically going to be embedded and extend throughout the width of that membrane, okay? So they're going to go from the inside of the cell all the way to the external compartment. Now, these integral proteins are important such that if you try to remove or release these integral proteins, you will disrupt that lipid bilayer. Okay, you will compromise the integrity of that cell membrane if you were to attempt to remove an integral protein. Okay, so an example of an integral protein are transmembrane proteins, again, that extend all the way throughout the width of the cell membrane. Okay, if you look at the image that we have down here in the left, we see the integral membrane protein is this blue structure that extends all the way through the width of the membrane. Okay, identify the integral membrane protein in this image. The other major class of membrane proteins are peripheral membrane proteins, okay? These are going to be proteins that are not embedded into that lipid bilayer, but they're going to be located on the outer or inner surface of the membrane, okay? Look at the image down below and locate a peripheral membrane protein, okay? They're not embedded in that lipid bilayer, but they're going to be in close association on either the inner surface of the membrane or the outer surface in contact with the extracellular environment, okay? So again, we have this phospholipid bilayer that makes up our plasma membrane, and embedded in that phospholipid bilayer are proteins. All right, so we have these membrane proteins that are super important for many different roles for the cell. Okay, and so we just defined two types of membrane proteins. We have integral membrane proteins, those that are going to be firmly bound. They're typically going to be those transmembrane proteins that are going to extend all the way throughout our membrane. And then we have our peripheral membrane proteins, where they're not embedded in the membrane, but they're going to be closely associated with the outer or inner surface of the plasma membrane. Some of the functions of membrane proteins, we mentioned anchoring. All right, we can anchor the cell to other substrates. For example, the integrins that are going to attach the cell to the extracellular matrix. Transport proteins, facilitating the transport of molecules across the membrane. Okay, so these transport proteins are embedded in the membrane, and they form channels, okay, or openings that are going to selectively allow for the passage of substances through that membrane. All right, enzymatic activity. We know that there's chemical reactions that can take place at the surface or at the cell membrane. All right, so enzymes, okay, can catalyze the reactions that are taking place near the cell surface. All right, so these are some important functions of membrane proteins. All right, so here's just a schematic of some of the major 6 major functions of membrane proteins. So transporting substances across the cell, enzymatic activity in order to catalyze the reactions that might take place near the cell membrane, signal transduction, so communicating from the external environment to the internal environment, cell-cell recognition, intercellular joining and attachment, adhering to the extracellular matrix. All right, so I want you to take a moment to recap these things that we just looked at in terms of our cell membrane. It is a very important structure. We're going to identify some of its vital roles. I want you to be able to describe the composition and how these membranes that are embedded in the how the proteins that are embedded in the membrane have a very important role in cell function. Okay.